Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Michael Wald, the Blood Detective, and welcome to this podcast. I think this one's a real life changer, and I've called it, Are You Body Blind? If yes, it can cost you years. So in just a moment, I'm going to define for you what body blind is, but I promise you this, if you fall within this category, you will not maximize your health endeavors. You will not maximize your quality of life. So let's get right into it. But first, I'll just let you know that this information is for your education. It is not meant as a substitute for sound medical or health advice. And the use or misuse of this information is on you. So I'm also a doctor of chiropractic with a board certification in nutrition. I have a master's degree in nutrition, a PhD in holistic philosophy. I provide acupuncture to my clients, and I'm a life coach. I even went to medical school and earned my MD diploma, but I do not have a license to practice medicine. So let's start off with a very important definition, one that I coined years ago to identify a certain type of person, a certain type of client that I come across where I know if they fit into this category and if they're not willing to change, they are wasting their time with me, or even their own health endeavors because of reasons you'll see in a moment. So body blind refers to a state in which a person neglects or ignores their physical health, either knowingly or unknowingly. This condition stems from a lack of awareness, misinformation, or willful avoidance of the body's signals like symptoms. Also, an avoidance of needs and risks. Being body blind often leads to poor choices that can accelerate aging, increase disease risk, and shorten your lifespan and your health span. So basically what I'm saying here, you're body blind if you basically have no power over your choices, specifically around the area of your mental, emotional, and physical health. So let me give you some concrete examples of what I'm talking about, and I promise you that you will fall into one of these several examples, if not all of them. So the first one is what I call exercise neglect. So a person will avoid all forms of physical activity, rationalizing their fatigue or their lack of time, contributing to muscle loss and also cardiovascular declines. Those are the results. If you're lazy and you don't exercise, you're going to lose lean body mass and compromise yourself from a cardiovascular perspective. So what I would suggest that you do, if you fall within that category, if that sounds familiar to you, is start with a 10-minute daily walk to build consistency and confidence. Put it in your schedule so that it is something you do every single day, so that over the course of months, it becomes a habit. Listen, you can have whatever negative and self-defeating thoughts that you have, but if you actually ignore those and set yourself up, like I'm explaining here, with just a 10-minute slot scheduled with you, then you will make progress. And all of a sudden, one day, you're going to notice your thinking is changing. So you want to schedule workouts just like any appointments, as I mentioned, to reinforce this habit and personal accountability. And the psychological strategy you want to be very well aware of here is that you want to reframe movement as a self-respect ritual rather than a chore. So let me say that again. You want to reframe movement, exercise, walking, as self-respect rather than a choice. And if you're saying, well, I don't have any self-respect, fine. Do it anyway. Do it anyway. That's all there is. The next habit, or bad habit, I should say, is poor nutrition. So this patient will tend to consume ultra-processed, nutrient-deficient foods every day without regard for long-term effects on their weight, their blood sugar, or inflammation. I see people on the streets and I wonder, it's very easy to tell that they are eating this way, what we call the standard American diet, SAD, the sad American diet. And I wonder, why are they doing this to themselves? It has a lot to do with lack of self-respect. So what do you do when you have this bad habit? Well, you want to replace one processed meal daily with whole foods, rich in fiber and protein. And you can listen to some of my other podcasts about more specifics about the foods. Just want you to get the concepts here. Because you can know about all the healthy foods you want, but if you can't overcome each of these problems here, each of these, let's say, negative mindsets, you'll simply get nowhere. So one of the ways to overcome bad eating habits is to keep a simple food journal to identify and correct nutritional gaps. And you might need the help of a nutritionist or holistically trained doctor to do that. So the psychological strategy here is to develop mindful eating by pausing before meals and ask, will this nourish me? And this is more powerful than it seems. And I've been doing this for years. Look, I like snack foods and unhealthy foods just as much as the next person. So what I do now is I'll take that food, let's say my cell phone is the food, and I will say, if I eat this, will it nourish me? And when you do this enough, you get to a point where, at least for me, when I ask that question, I'm immediately disgusted with what it is I'm holding in my hand, whatever that food is. Sometimes it's different degrees of disgusting, which means I could still have some of it. I'm somewhat disgusted, but the point is that it will regulate your eating habits. It will allow you to think. And as I said here, the psychological strategy is to be mindful when you're eating. So that means you must draw your attention to what it is you're eating and ask yourself that question, will it nourish me? And do this every time you eat. And over time, your thinking will change, and then your actions will change, and your habits will change, and your health will change. And what about ignoring symptoms? This is a big one. I have people that have come to me and they'll say, Dr. Wald, and this actually happened just a few days ago. I was speaking with a woman on the phone and she said, Dr. Wald, I'm embarrassed to tell you, but I haven't seen a doctor in at least 10 years. And, sometimes my initial response is, well, good for you. And I assume they're taking care of themselves and have a mindful perspective about their own bodies. But she had a zillion different health problems. So she was simply afraid. So this personality of clients that I see, or people, disregard chronic symptoms like pain, fatigue, digestive issues, assuming that they'll pass or they're just normal, and they rationalize them away. And what I would suggest to do is you want to commit to logging your symptoms weekly and sharing them with a healthcare provider to discuss whether or not these symptoms really warrant some further attention or whether or not they actually should be ignored. You want to educate yourself on early warning signs of common chronic illnesses. And in fact, I'll be doing a podcast about this, the early warning signs of cancer, autoimmune disease, and other health problems that people miss. And the psychological strategy here, and you can tell that I have a psychological strategy for each of these problems, is to shift one's mindset from avoidance to curiosity. View symptoms as meaningful data and not threats. I mean, why wouldn't you know if why you're tired all the time? Because some people, I'll tell you the answer right now, they don't want to know because they're afraid it's cancer or some hidden disease. This is a big, big issue, and I can see it on people. But a lot of times, maybe even most of the time, these symptoms that you might be ignoring, they're not necessarily horrific health problems, but they're chronic, so they deserve some attention. And then once you learn, let's say that your fatigue might be from, let's say, iron anemia, or maybe you're not eating enough protein, maybe you're not sleeping well enough, maybe you have too much stress, whatever the issues are, once you learn those things and you have that understanding, it's much more familiar to you, and it should be less frightening to you. So that way you can own these symptoms, understand them, and then take the action steps you need because you know what's going on. Next, mental health avoidance. So these are individuals who avoid emotional self-reflection or mental health supports, leading to unchecked anxiety, depression, or stress-related illness, just to name a few things. So people are suffering needlessly with these problems. Again, anxiety, depression, and just overall sense of well-being when they might be able to get productive help from, let's say, a therapist or possibly a life coach. So what I would suggest is to practice mindfulness, which means you draw your attention to your symptoms, in a sense, sort of hyper-focusing on them, and reflect upon them, and then get whatever help that you need. Why wouldn't a person get the help that they need for mental health problems or physical health problems? One, because they're just ignorant of the whole process. And two, that they are lazy. Number three, they don't know anything about their health at all, and they can't understand what to do. And also, some people are just downright petrified of what they might find. And again, to manage that problem sometimes means that you have to focus on the actual problem. The very thing that you're fearful of, you want to focus on. So it becomes more familiar, as I said earlier, then you can take the correct steps. So, for example, one of the correct steps would be to seek professional counseling or join a support group for stress and emotional processing. So the psychological underpinning strategy here is to normalize emotional expression by identifying it as a strength not a weakness. I mean, if you're anxious, the body doesn't have anxiety for no reason. You may not know the reason because, for example, anxiety attacks by definition come on without any trigger, although sometimes there is an obvious trigger. But the thing, though, is that if you are feeling anxiety or even depression, there may be reasons. So these may be what they call survival emotions. So if you're anxious, there may be real reasons why you're anxious. For example, I experience anxiety when, not all the time, but a good maybe 50% of the time when I'm in very high places. There was a time I jumped out of an airplane. There was a time I bungee cord jumping. There was a time I rock climbed. And as soon as the height hit me, I was in a full-blown panic attack. Now, that is a superpower because my body is telling me through evolution that I should not be doing these things. So that's how they work on a daily basis. We don't feel anything for no reasons. Okay, next one. No preventative care. So these people do not engage in regular health checkups, whether it's through traditional medical doctors or even holistic doctors. They don't do any health screenings or lab work. And they also, therefore, miss early signs of serious conditions like cancer or heart disease. I've seen this happen where I've begged people to get things checked out further. I've recommended other tests. They haven't done it, and some bad stuff happens. So the suggestion would be to schedule annual checkups and set reminders for follow-up tests. People will say to me, "Oh, Dr. Wald, I can't remember all this." I'm like, you have an iPhone, right? So use your calendar. And most people don't know how to use their basic technologies, so learn those technologies. Believe me, you've learned harder things. And you can also use, at the very minimum, in terms of preventative care, there are at-home lab kits or mobile health services, right? We can get online and we can have a conversation with a healthcare provider, and we can also order kits for our laboratory tests, even ourselves. I mean, we've got it all at our fingertips these days. So in terms of preventative care or the lack thereof, the psychological underlying strategy is to replace the "I'll deal with it later" thinking with early detection, which prevents or protects your future self. So prevention is the way to go, and you must understand that. If you don't have an understanding that it is easier to fix something early on in a disease process or a dis-ease process than later, then of course you will not make the necessary changes in how you respond. And then the final one is substance or behavior dependence. So this person rationalizes their daily alcohol intake, poor sleep habits, or screen overuse, whether it's the computer or their phone, as a stress relief, compounding systemic health deterioration. And, you know, I've had people sit in front of me and they'll say, "Well, you know, Dr. Wald, I drink some alcohol every night. How much do you drink?" Just one. One what? One bottle or two bottles. And they've done this for so long, they think it's fine because they seem to be functioning well. Well, when you look at their chemistry, they're not functioning very well. And my point here is that we need to not rationalize these bad habits. So the psychological strategy underpinning this, of course, there are many, but just at least a basic one to consider to try to break this psychological habits and be dependent on these poor habits is to explore the emotional need or needs behind the habit and find non-harmful ways to satisfy that need. So I hope that you can go over this podcast again because these are very, very important. If you are an individual that suffers from body blind, to whatever extent, these are things you can do something about. Finally, when I sit with a person and identify some of these body blind, let's say, characteristics, we then put a plan together in terms of how to structure your life so that you can implement those underlying psychological strategies that I've talked about during each of these examples so that you are successful. And at least what I do is I meet a person where they're at and we slowly build a system of habits that support you in the long term. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this was useful for you, and I'll see you at the next podcast. Thank you.